Yamadumurang, Nadu Yinjamara Barundari Main Kulan Main, Yinjamara Barundari Nurambang. In my language, I want to pay respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are meeting here tonight, and send my love and respects to the members of the stolen generations on this anniversary of the apology. Tonight, who do you trust in a world that feels increasingly out of our control? Whether it's the Reserve Bank upping interest rates, Chinese spy balloons, or artificial intelligence that may make us redundant. Joining our panel, British journalist and host of the News Agents podcast, John Sopel. Green Senator for WA, Dorinda, who is today appointed as the party's First Nations spokesperson. Liberal member for Menzies and Afghanistan veteran Keith Wolahan. Minister for Youth and Early Childhood Education, Anne Ali. And Professor of Artificial Intelligence at UNSW, Toby Walsh. So I want to bring in Amy Yetfoy, who is going to join us from Padstow in New South Wales. Amy, thank you for joining us on the program. I want to ask you about your situation and what the increase in interest rates has meant for you in terms of what you are paying now, the money you have to find that you didn't have to find before.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hi, panel. It's absolutely right. So, you know, when we first financed our home, because of the very small amount that we had, you know, initially to put down for it, we had to split our loan into half fixed, or a lot more fixed and a lot less variable. And so, you know, with all of this increasing, we've recently refinanced the last 12 months to 18 months or so, which has meant an additional 20% in our mortgage repayments monthly for us. And then our fixed rate, which is due to expire at the end of this year towards beginning of next year, which is our largest chunk, at current interest rates, we're looking at additionally $500 a week on our initial loan. Which
$500 a week. And so where does that come from? What do you cut back on?
Everything, Stan. You know, it's nice to hear that we're trying to do things, but when you have two children, $150 doesn't go very far. When it costs you $800 for, this is in a public school, for school uniforms, just to get us set up for summer. So, you know, I see little things happening, but at the end of the day, you know, I can't earn anymore. My capacity is what it's at. So is my partner. He works shift work. My children are too young to work, so what do we do?
And one of the things, Amy, to do, I suppose, is you have to look at the reality, and people are going to face this, of potentially having to sell your homes. Are you at that point yet?
We are considering it, Stan. You know, when our fixed rate comes up in the next 12 months, when we can't afford an additional $500 a week, we actually really don't know what we're going to do. You know, living in Southwest Sydney, we can't even rent a place. And, you know, I talked to my husband about it a lot over the last 12 months, and he says we couldn't even sell this house to buy another one. So it's not, we're in a very, you know, tough position right now.
So what's the question you would like to put to our panel?
Look, so I guess it's twofold. I mean, who is responsible for making these decisions that put so much strain on family life? And if you're saying the Reserve Bank's independent, they have so much power to control my life is incredible. And why is interest rates the focus of slowing the economy? Surely there's other things that we can do.
I want to go to the politicians in a moment, but I'll bring John in now because, John, you've observed this in other parts of the world as well. This is a phenomenon that's been sweeping through the world and real people getting hurt.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be much comfort to any of you if I say that inflation is 7.8%. I think in Australia it's 9.2%, in the UK. Interest rates are 3.5% here, they're 4% in the UK. And it's going to be really uncomfortable for huge numbers of people. I don't think that people kind of, you know, the basic concept of inflation everyone gets. If it costs more to fill your car and more to fill the grocery trolley and you've got the same amount of money or declining money, then you're worse off. And everyone is feeling worse off. The thing about interest rates is that, I mean, what happened in the UK and happened here, I suspect, is that banks were given the task of taking politics out of interest rate decisions so that they can only do one thing, which is raise or cut interest rates. In Britain, we had an experiment with cutting taxes when Liz Truss was the Prime Minister. it didn't go very well.
For 5 minutes.
She took the economy over the edge of a cliff, and she was gone within 7 weeks, became the shortest time of a Prime Minister in British history. So I think that there are no easy answers. And it's true in America, and it's true in Britain, it's true in Europe, and there are real pressures. The only thing I would say that, looking at the latest stats coming out of the US, is that they feel they've turned the corner, that inflation has peaked, that there will not be the same need for aggressive interest rate rises. And I guess that's a small crumb of comfort. But if you're struggling to pay the mortgage and pay the food bills...
or sell your house. And the question is, why interest rates? Is that the only means of being able to slow inflation? Because it's a blunt instrument, we know, and it hurts the most vulnerable.
Well, as I said, the Reserve Bank makes its decisions independently. I know that there is some controversies around the Reserve Bank governor, but his term comes up in September. And
are you saying that you want him gone in September?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I actually, that's something that's not even in my portfolio. So that's something for the Treasurer and the government more broadly to decide. Look, I think there are so many global headwinds at the moment, and we live in some, really, really uncertain economic times. And I know that, like John said, nothing that I say is going to ease that pressure off people who are experiencing this. I think $500 increase a week, I just think that's crazy. That's just phenomenal, and I really feel for you, having been in that situation myself, where I've had to scrimp and save to put food on the table. I really feel it acutely, that pain that people are feeling, both in my electorate and across Australia. What I can say is, as John has said, despite all of these global headwinds, the Treasurer has said that he believes that inflation has peaked, and that we can look forward to the future. I think there is a glimmer of optimism there, and that things will get better once more of our cost of living relief measures come into play. Like I don't know if you use early childhood education at all for your 2 children, but there will be some relief there for the fees for early childhood education. And I know it feels like empty words coming from a politician, but take it from somebody who is a single mum and who's been through that as well, and who's lived in poverty, that I know that nothing we say is going to make it better for you.
Hands up who'd like to see the Reserve Bank governor here answering some questions about... Yes, we have asked Philip Lowe to come on the program twice. We're yet to get... We'll keep asking. Can I bring you back in a moment? Yeah, sure. You want to go to Toby, because, Toby, there are other options, aren't there, in terms of interest rates and mortgages and locking people in for longer at lower rates? It is. In Australia, we're much more exposed than in other countries like the United States. In the United States, if you take a mortgage out, you take out a 30-year term fixed-rate mortgage. You know exactly what you're going to be up for when you take that mortgage out. There is no shock. Only a third of our mortgages are fixed rate, and half of those fixed rate mortgages this year will end. And people will face the sort of bill shock that you talk about, over $1,000 a month. Some people even $2,000 a month. That is a big risk. If we want to encourage people to become homeowners, then removing that uncertainty, giving us the certainty of fixing our mortgages. I refixed my mortgage last year. The longest possible you could get is 5 years. You can't get a long fixed mortgage. That adds to our problems. It makes us much more exposed. And what I worry about is if we have many more interest rates rises, we're going to go into recession. An unnecessary recession. I want to get a quick comment from you, Keith, and we move on.
So the Reserve Bank governor will be putting questions, we'll put questions to him. He'll be at the Senate on Wednesday, and I'm on the House Economics Committee, and we'll be asking him questions on Friday. But
I think they'd like to ask the questions, wouldn't
Of course, and we'll be asking on your behalf.
Get your questions in now.
Please do. But there's 2 levers here. Monetary policy is one lever, and it is blunt, and it hurts people. But it's a necessary one. The other one is fiscal policy, which is the role for government, and it's about reducing spending. Labor and Liberal need to reduce spending in government, and it brings inflation down and it helps people. You can't have one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake, and currently that's what we're doing. The IMF has warned against that. We have $45 billion from this government in off-market spending. That's inflationary, and it's not good enough, and it's going to hurt people.
Amy, I want to thank you. Thank you for your question, Amy. Good luck to you. Good luck to your family. I hope things go well for you. Thank you again.
Well, I'm 83 years old, a former British subject, and I've lived through all the wars since 1939. I was born at the beginning of 1939. Since wars are becoming more and more destructive and never seem to achieve a better world, do we need a pact tying us to the US and the UK, AUKUS? Will Australia be obliged to follow either of these two countries into yet even more conflict?
Anne.
Thank you, Brenda. It's lovely to see you here. Thank you for the question. I think there is an important role for collective security, and historically, if you look at attempts at collective security, many of them have failed because of differences in values and an assumption of universal kind of values around security. I think for Australia it's important that we do have alliances with the US and with the UK that would help us in security and in defence matters. It's an important alliance for Australia and one that we need to pursue, but that doesn't preclude us from also pursuing, as Dorinda suggested, security and peace in our region. And Penny Wong has been incredibly active as the Foreign Minister, going out there and in the Pacific, with Indonesia, even resetting our ties with China, even, or the ways in which we relate with China. There is a huge part for us to play in our region. But there is also an importance for us to maintain a security alliance with like-minded countries.
Sorry, Anne, but that's trying to walk both sides of the street. And at certain points...
Well,
OK, here's an example. We hear this a lot. If there was a conflict over Taiwan tomorrow, you wouldn't be walking two sides of the street, and there are choices to be made. So while you're building closer relationships with China right now, inevitably, choices are made about where Australia's interests are served. Are they more served by closer ties to the UK and the US than they are in ties with China?
Well, I don't think it's about building more closer ties with China. I think that's kind of misconstruing the relationship here. I think we do have a very strong trade relationship with China. I mean, let's face it, we rely on China for a lot of the products that we use every day. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I do think that we need to build our sovereign capability more, and we're certainly working on that, and Ed Husick has done some amazing work in that space, and we need to be more independent. But we do have... China is an important trading partner for Australia. That doesn't mean that we can't call out China on human rights abuses. That doesn't mean that, you know, we can't have the kind of relationship or diplomatic ties with China that allow us to still maintain our sovereignty and our security and the security of our region, Stan. You know, like, you can have a friend, but be able to be very frank with that friend and, you know, have that friendship on your terms.
Keith, that's not often how China responds, though. And of course, we've seen China take trade sanctions against Australia when it doesn't like decisions that are made. Now we see Australia taking out Chinese-supplied cameras from defence installations because of concerns.
We should be building our own cameras.
So how do we manage this moment, Keith?
I think to the question, Brenda, I've served in war. I was in Afghanistan 3 times. I would never wish that on anyone else or my children. So I'm not in the business of starting wars. We're in the business of preventing wars. And weakness is provocative. So it's in our interest to form alliances, especially with like-minded democracies, because democracies are being threatened by autocracies around the world. And I ask you to look at 2 examples. The end of the Afghanistan war, which was tragic, that sent a signal that contributed to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. It sent a signal of weakness. But then you look at the people of Ukraine and what they're doing standing up to the Russian invasion. That is sending a signal to the region, one that I think will bring us peace in this region. So it's important that we show strength and that we stand with allies who are democracies.
Brenda, it's such a good question because obviously people feel that, you know, if only we could just do things easily. If you look at Northern Europe, where the Second World War was largely fought, where my father served as a service, you know, was in the war, NATO, which was formed in 1948, has sort of kept the peace. Not perfectly, but sort of kept the peace ever since then. And so alliances are not just a way of kind of protecting yourself, they enhance your own sovereignty because they reduce the risk that any one country will attack you. And I know that that is what the architects of AUKUS, and I was the BBC's North America editor when it got signed and the French suddenly pulled their ambassador out of Washington, which seemed an extraordinary thing to do. But it does seem interesting what has happened. And Australia plays a vital role in the Five Eyes Agreement. And, you know, I was endlessly asked to talk about the special relationship.
The intelligence sharing agreement.
Yeah, the intelligence sharing agreement between Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Canada and the US. And the US really value that, and that is really important towards national security as well. So cooperation, I think, if you look over history, has helped us and helped stop wars, not start them.
I'm not sure Brenda's entirely convinced, are you, Brenda?
No, doesn't look convinced.
Well, over the past 50 years or so, we've been drawn into wars by the US. The US took us into you know, Vietnam and into all these other places. Is this going to happen again? This is what I'm saying. If we have a pact with them and the US decides, not us, the US decides that they're going to go into a war, do we follow like we've done before?
I'll go to Dorinda.
Yeah, great. Brenda, and you've articulated that so beautifully. And what I was going to say is that what is extremely obvious, and Anne actually mentioned it, was about our sovereign capability. We do not have the infrastructure here in Australia to support nuclear submarines. That is obvious. We are getting into an arrangement and into a relationship, an ongoing relationship with the US, because we don't have that sovereign capability. We are actually creating a rod for our own back. So you're exactly right in what you're saying. And we absolutely, I mean, the Greens have always had a policy about no nuclear and no nuclear subs, and we will continue to stand by that. So I think we have to honour that.
Thank you, Brenda.
Question for you, Toby Walsh. I very recently read an article in which it described a situation in which AI was unexpectedly found to be very proficient in designing a lethal new nerve agent. Is it possible for designers using AI to ever anticipate such potentially lethal outcomes? And if they do, and what to do if such outcomes are discovered?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, if you can get the original program was designed to come up with nice chemicals, useful chemicals, and then they just turned it around and said, well, OK, let's ask the opposite question. Can you design something that's quite dangerous? And it was actually very effective at designing some recognised nerve agents. And that is the consequence of AI is entirely dual use. There are positive uses, and often the very same algorithms can be put to very negative uses. And it's how we choose...
Like human beings.
Like human beings, yes. But an added complication is the unexpected consequences that we often cannot predict. We can't see. In that case, we've seen a few things like that in the past. It was possible. I mean, they asked the question. The fact they asked the question, they knew that it was possible. But the unexpected consequences, and we see this at scale with companies like Meta, because we've never had a technology before where you can touch 1 billion people overnight. And even small effects on our social media that can polarize us, that can change our political debate, can have really profound impacts and can then end up with changing the outcome of an election, as we possibly saw in the US, or change the outcome of a referendum, as we saw with Brexit. There are very profound consequences of this technology, and we have to think very carefully through it.
What do we do, Dorinda?
I think this is ever evolving and evolving very, very rapidly. And I agree with Keith's comment around the regulatory framework that this needs to sit within. What I also think is really important to acknowledge is the data that you input into that. It's only as good as that, right? Like it can only be as good as the human data that's being put into it. But also we all have that experience of being unsafe on the internet. And I think reinforcing some of those structural disadvantages, such as facial recognition, that's already been proven. It's well held as a view. And we have to understand that disadvantaged groups, whether it's gender, race and others, are going to be heightened in this evolution of AI in the future.
I want to come back... I want to come back to you, Joan, in just a moment, because you work in education, so I want to come back to you on how this affects education. But Keith, as someone who served in war, and Toby's touched on the consequences of this, we see this with drone warfare now as well, where people can be killed without ever having to look into their eyes. Robot armies, which don't make human calculations, human decisions that are indefatigable. They'll just march and fight to beyond exhaustion, because they don't get exhausted. What does it mean for the battlefield, and what does it mean for warfare?
It's a very good question. So there was a study done on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I think around 2014, and 90% of the civilian casualties were in error, human error. And so humans, we made mistakes. And you're right, the further you are from the battlefield in an aircraft or operating a drone, the more likely you'll make a mistake. And I saw it. I saw times when there was a drone that looked like someone was carrying an explosive, and then on further investigation, they were carrying a baby. And you need a human there to make those sort of calculations, because I don't trust an algorithm to show compassion and humanity, even when all the boxes are ticked to engage. And we need more of that.
Joan, for education, and we talked about ChatGPT, and that can do your homework apparently as well. If only it was around. What are the consequences for education as you see it from AI?
Well, I'm not so worried about cheating in education, to be honest. I'm more concerned about the deeper issue. I played around with ChatGPT yesterday, asking wonderful questions, and I'm teaching Nietzsche on Friday, people who might know.
Nietzsche and ChatGPT opens up all sorts of possibilities.
But it was fantastic.
He did say God was dead, and maybe that's what artificial intelligence means.
But it blew my mind because I asked the question, what would Nietzsche think of AI? And this wonderful answer came back, and it made me really reflect on really what does it mean. This is getting a bit philosophic, I know, but really our humanness. And if we've got these large language models and they can produce this wonderful stuff, not like your poor Dave, you're poor him. Really, what does it mean? What happens to our creativity, or what could happen to human creativity, our individuality, our real sense of being human, really, if there's this huge model that can produce this amazing stuff? It blew my mind. Yeah. Really?
I might throw that one to John. Nietzsche and AI, John, in 10 seconds.
I thought that there'd be a lot we'd be discussing this evening, but Nietzsche I didn't have on my dance card. No. I think it's really important questions, because I think that actually, Dorinda, what you said is right and sort of not, because you've now got machine learning. You've now got machines that are able to learn themselves and decide which way they're going to take themselves. And I just kind of worry that, in putting this in a slightly political context, is that throughout this kind of the whole internet age, regulation has just simply not been able to keep up with the technological changes that are leaping forward from Alphabet, from Google, from Meta and Facebook, and all the rest of it. And legislators, whether in Australia, whether in Britain, whether in America, are totally left behind by this.
So Anne, just quickly on that, and this is your wheelhouse, of course, because it's early childhood education.
And there are. This really raises questions about ethics. and the ethics of AI and the responsibility of those who are producing
and also regulation. It raises about what you're prepared to allow.
Ethics, regulation, and think about the privacy of your information. Every time you ask the chatbot that question, more and more information is being put into the big data pool from which it pulls. So there are real ethical and legal questions around this. And you're absolutely right, John. We are miles behind where we need to be, and technology is so rapidly evolving that it's almost the horse is already bolted, right? But on the use of AI for criminal activities and the bad use of AI, I've always said criminals are not innovators, they're opportunists. So whatever technology happens, whatever advances in technology happen, they're going to find ways to exploit that. We need to be building technology with safeguards in place. For example, the cheating thing. Why couldn't it have a watermark on it? That if you print out from an essay, hand it in, there's a watermark on it that the teacher knows that it's not yours, okay? Me as a teacher, when I was teaching, when I was a professor, I could tell straight away if someone's work they cheated, because I insisted that they reference their work absolutely perfectly in Cambridge style. The AI can't do that. It can. It can reference in Cambridge perfectly with the right full stop and comma.
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Okay.
The BBC has a global reach like no other news outlet. However, it also has its problems, strict impartiality being one, which I assume, John, were instrumental in you seeking a new career direction. Nearly a year on from your departure, how do you think the BBC needs to change in the future if it's to maintain its integrity and influence?
What a great question. Well, thank you for that. I mean, part of the reason I left the BBC, you're right. I thought that they were getting the definition of impartiality wrong, by which I mean, and I think that public broadcasters around the world are struggling with this, whether it's here in Australia or in Britain as well. But, you know, when I was covering Donald Trump at the White House, and something that was, I won the 2020 election. No, you didn't. The votes didn't stack up, and sometimes there are issues where there is not, on the one hand, on the other. Some people say 2 + 2 is 4. Others say 2 + 2 is 6. Only time will tell. John Sopel, BBC News, Westminster. No, 2 + 2 is 4. And we've got to be able to have the confidence to say that. And I sometimes think that public service broadcasters, struggle with that a bit and just kind of get themselves tied into knots. And I saw it, I felt over the Brexit debate.
Well, I was going to get to that. How did that play out, the idea of impartiality both sides in a referendum like Brexit?
So there was a false equivalence that took place whereby you'd say, well, some economists say it's going to be a catastrophe for the UK economy, others say it's going to be great. Actually, nearly every eminent economist said it was going to be bad, and, you know, 7 years after the vote on Brexit, it's not going that well. Whereas you had to struggle to find the people who would say Brexit is going to be a liberation for the UK economy. And so I sometimes think that we give people a misleading impression in news by acting as if they're... I mean, what is the equivalence of... Some people say that Ukraine has been badly done by the invasion of Russia, but others would say, no, it was wrong. It was a flagrant breach of international law that Russia went across the border with Ukraine. And I think sometimes we need to have the boldness to say things. I believe in impartiality, but I think it needs to be a bit more muscular and a bit more aggressive sometimes, because there is so much false information out there.
Just hold that thought, Keith. Just hold that thought for a moment, Keith, because I do want to go to Dorinda, because John raised the impact of media coverage and impartiality on Brexit. And I'm just wondering, we're facing a referendum this year over The Voice. How are you seeing that play out in the media debate and the way it's being framed around questions of impartiality? Who gets to speak? On the other hand, on this hand. How do you think it's impacting it so far?
Well, I think it's very easy, Stan, and I want to thank Tony for the question. And I think it can be hijacked very, very easily. And I think that, giving a plug for the ABC, the independent, it should be well-resourced. It basically creates such an important platform, and particularly for our mobs in regional, rural and remote areas, you know, having access to that information, being able to get that information that is impartial, that is independent, but also we need to make sure that it's well-resourced. And we see that particularly in emergency management and disasters like floods and bushfires. This is why it's so important. It is so critical. And in the voice context, it's absolutely critical because we need to hear all sides of that to be able to remain impartial.
Keith.
No, thank you for that, and congratulations to Dorinda on her elevation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look, we are having a referendum here, and I'll take the word muscular that you used about defending what's right. We've got to be very careful about that, and I'll give an example from the US election, and I agree, you know, there was a result, and it should be respected by those who didn't succeed. But the Hunter Biden story was put aside as fake news, but it was
Joe Biden's son.
That's right, and it was a legitimate story that should have been aired in the United States, but people decided they shouldn't hear it. We should never have that in a democracy. So in this coming referendum, I'm really pleased to see that the Albanese government is going to have a pamphlet go out to all households showing a yes and a no case. And no criticism of you, Stan, and the ABC, but I remember once there was
We're big enough to take it, Keith.
I'm going to have to take it.
Go ahead.
I'm going to
take your shot.
I remember, you know, long-time viewer, but I remember watching an episode that you did on The Voice, and there was no one speaking against it. And that's changed, but we should always trust Australians with hearing both sides of an argument, even on the ABC.
And sometimes we ask and people don't turn up, but you did tonight, Keith, and I thank you for it. We can only speak to the people who will come on. That's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel. Dave wasn't here. In spirit, he felt like he was. John Sopel, Dorinda Cox, Keith Wolahan, Anne Ali and Toby Walsh. Please thank them. Thank you for sharing your stories and questions. Next week, we're live again from Melbourne. And joining me will be, this is a good one, join me next week, tennis champion and broadcaster Jelena Dokic, Communications Minister Michelle Rowland, Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman, and youth advocate Imogen Senior. A lot of discussion next week about social media as well. So head to our website to register to be in the audience. You've been fantastic tonight. Thank you so much. We had a laugh as well. Have a good night. Thank you.